My folks came from Germany originally, and they came into eastern Ohio and West Virginia to work in the coal mines. Well, then they heard about the Lower Yellowstone project being built between Glendive and Sydney, and they needed coal miners. There were a lot of cowboys and teamsters, but not very many coal miners, and they needed coal for construction of the dam and the ditch and everything. So they came out here to work the coal mines and mine coal for the project. And then, of course, after they was here a year or two, then they free land, they homesteaded. They thought it would be a better life, and of course it was. But it was a tough life, but it was better. And a chance to own your own land. Owning land was pretty important to those people. And of course in Germany you could never get to own any land because it was owned by land barons, and ordinary people would never get to own land there. And of course out here they could own land, and that's what they wanted. Well, they came by train as far as Glendive, and then stagecoach out to Intake to work on the Lower Yellowstone project. 4 horses on the stagecoach, wagon, covered wagon. And Ma said that was sure some trip because the ruts were deep and it was mud.
I left home the 2nd. I got on the boat in Belfast the 3rd of March. I landed in St. John's the 16th of March. It was rough. It was very rough, for we were too long. From the 3rd to the 16th, they would have made it in 8 days. But we got into a bad storm, them big rollers, not white tops, them big rollers. And he got between 2, but he was lucky they got the boat headed for this big roller. If it had stayed flat, it would have covered and put us to the bottom. There was 3 other Irish boys, right from where I come from. Yes, but there was a lot of Scotch on the boat, and a lot of Scotch people with families. For the government, I think, was paying their way, but my dad paid my way. I knew there was guys here in Miles City from home, but I didn't know them, but I knew they were here, and I figured I would meet them and that I would get a job with the sheep. It's the sheep I wanted. It wasn't the farming. I was farming in Canada, but it was with the sheep. And when I got to Miles City, I heard about Montana Bar in Ireland, and here I sees the Montana Bar, and I went in there. And Mr. Kinney says, "Kid, are you all right? Have you money?" I says, "Yes, I have." And he says, "I'll get you." "What kind of a job?" I says, "I want to go with the sheep." He says, "They're all lambing, so they'll not be here. But I'll get you a job." So the next day I went into the bar again, and I met old Arthur Connick and Big Jimmy Fitzpatrick and Pete Colgan from Ireland, right from home. And old Connick asked me, he says, "Are you on your relation to Jimmy Killen in Ireland?" I says to me son, he says, "Jacobstown, you've got a job for a moment." Well, I left Ireland. See, I was in that trouble in Ireland. But that was for freedom. That wasn't religion. And then the Free Mountain was covered. Then we run the sheep on Canada State. But the government bought up Canada State and planted timber. So we couldn't run sheep there no more. And there was no room on the Free Mountain because there was too many sheep. So I decided to get out of there.
Well, I came out from Missouri, but the family wasn't out here because my mother passed away when I was quite small. And then I had a sister that lived in Livingston for a long time before we ever thought about any of the rest of us thought about coming out. And then I had a sister that was out here, and she came back, and that was during the homestead days when she wanted me, and she talked me into coming out. Into such a mess. But she said, oh, this was a great country, and which I got used to it, but then I began to like it, and I really think it's great. Well, we came out on the steamer, the regular trains then was the steam engines, and we came out we had a lot of floods back there during that time, and we were several days coming out, and then we came to Harlowtown. We got on the electric train. They'd just finished that up, the Milwaukee. There was 4 trains going through Ringling at that time, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, 1 in the evening. And they were the electric trains, and they went to the coast. So it was a pretty nice trip from Harlowtown on out. No trees, no flowers, just hills and sagebrush, and mountains. I thought I just couldn't take that. It was pretty hard to get used to after coming from this city where there's lots of pretty trees and flowers and walnut trees and hickory nuts and all of that, You raised anything you put in the ground, and then had lots of fruit trees. And I couldn't get used to that. I just couldn't see where there was any greatness to being out here on a homestead, but a lot of them was coming. And I was used to going to church and to Sunday school and everything, and out here in the God-forsaken country, no churches, no church, nobody even mentioned church. You never heard the Bible read. You never heard nobody saying a prayer or nothing. And I thought I was living in a regular heathen country. I didn't like it. I thought it was the jumping off place. This is a place where people either went nuts or something happened to them. I didn't think that you could live in this country. Didn't see nothing to live for.
It didn't look very good. It was different than Ireland altogether. But the sheep looked good. Rogers had good sheep. And that looked good, but the range, I wasn't acquainted with that kind of range at all, For I worked on the mountain in Ireland quite a lot, on the Free Mountain, and the estate, Canada Estate too. Yeah, but I got used to it. It didn't look too hot to start with. It was pretty damn lonesome for a while, but I was used with a lot of company.
They thought it was kind of a jumping off place. They thought it was, the men liked it better than the women. The men liked this country because it was a lot of hunting and fishing, and they liked that. Of course, it was a tough country for the women. A real hard country for women to live in. The winters were cold, and they had to carry water in from a well, and no electricity. And it was darn tough on women. I think we owned it my folks about 1905 or 6. But then the big thing was opened about 1908 or 9. That's when they really opened up everything. See, they'd open up just a small area at a time to begin with to see what it was like. The very first homesteads, the very first land was settled at Bloomfield about 1904, and they were Mennonites, if I'm right about it, and they wanted to know if they could raise wheat in this country. Well, the Mennonites were good farmers, and they were from Kansas, the most of them, and they raised good wheat, so then the government have kept opening more and more for homesteading. Well, there was pretty good prices for the crops, and a lot of land available, and all kinds of people to do the work, a lot of help available, and of course there wasn't much of anything else for them to do. Quarter section originally. That is, within 5 miles of the river, it was a quarter section. Got 5 miles away from the river, it'd be 320. As I remember my mother saying, that's the way it was. If you got certain amount of miles away from the river, you get a half a section.
Well, they were just people coming to take up the homesteads. They thought they was going to, I guess, find a pot of gold up there. I don't know. They had big ideas, but they didn't last long. They just couldn't make it. They figured that they'd give it a try and see what they could do in it. Maybe it would turn out all right, but I know it didn't turn out for quite a few of them. They picked up and there was cabins, shanties on every 160 acres just about it. People was, they really, a lot of them came out, and the train, there was lots of people came. I don't know, a lot of them stopped at Harlowtown, stopped all through, all the way out, They was coming in and going.
There was people homesteaded here. There was guys with teams took them out on the homesteaded land that they didn't get at all. They showed them, what did they know? Showed a nice piece of land here. Maybe the homestead, according to the number, was 10 miles from there. What did they know? Well, there weren't land agents, there were guys that just showed them where these homesteads was. I think that's what they were. Had horses and buggies and took them here and took them there. And this is your homestead. This is where it wasn't theirs, it wasn't what they got at all. That was maybe away in the Badlands. No damn good at all. And they didn't know it. What did they know? What did I know when I come? About sections or section corners or, just as green as I was.
Well, they had to improve, and they had to prove up on their homesteads, I think you had to live on that homestead. I believe it was 3 years out of 5 that you had to be on the homestead for at least full 3 years. Well, they couldn't live on the homestead for that. They had to get out and work. They just had to, it just didn't work out that way. They couldn't, and there wasn't enough jobs in the country to keep all of those people working. So it just couldn't be. Those homesteads wasn't that bucket of gold, waiting for.
A lot of them would come over and get a homestead, and they'd borrow all the money they could on it, and then they'd leave. I've got some homestead land that they'd borrowed all the money they could on it and left. So they used their homestead rights, and they'd borrow from the bankers or federal government or somebody, and they'd leave.
Arthur got me the job, but Fitzpatrick took me out to Tommy Rogers. And I got out to Rogers, and Fitzpatrick gave me a bedroll. What did I know about a bedroll? And when I got out there, I asked Tommy Rogers, I says, where'll I put this bed? He says, there's a whole damn section. There's lots of room. There was no house. A lot of cowboys come, maybe a couple of them were riding and they couldn't get back to the Yellowstone or wherever. They would pull in and you would feed their horse or put them out in the pasture if you didn't have hay. And You would feed him and he would sleep and stay. It was customary here to not lock the doors, because if you come here and it was storming and the party gone, you could go in and you would fix something to eat and be damn sure they cleaned up your dishes. And if there was firewood, chop some more and leave the box full, you know what I mean. And the schoolhouses, the outside doors, darned be locked, for that was a place for to go in for shelter if it stormed. Yes. Oh yes. You were welcome, you bet, and most. I know it one, but very, very few. You were always welcome.
Everybody was friendly. They do whatever they could to help one another, and if they knew of anybody in dire need or anything, they'd do all they could to help him out. It was great. I think that's one thing that made the West, was the people were so ready to help one another.
They had to work together because otherwise they couldn't get the job done. You know, they pretty hard to get a thrashing crew with just one man. You'd have to get 5 or 6, 7 farmers together.
We learned to work, and he had sheep, and in the lambing time we helped with herd the bunches. You know, as the lambs got older, they were put out with their mothers on the range or out on the pastures, and we went along with the rest of them that was big enough to herd bunches. We got out and herded bunches of sheep and worked. There was no dull moments on the ranch. We was all busy.
Plowing up that virgin soil with horses was pretty difficult. Some people would get those great big steamers in and hire it done, but that cost quite a lot of money. So he broke the most of his with a walking plow and 4 horses. Broke the most of his that way. That's a slow procedure. About 4 acres a day.
If I'd have had enough money to buy a ticket back, I'd have went back, because I sure didn't like the looks of things. And so many people were coming in, taking up homesteads, you know. It was quite a country then. And we was out there, we had no electricity, no nothing, and we used oil lamps and the old galvanized tubs for a bathtub. And spring house, he had a little, well, it was just kind of a uphill, but at the base of that, there was a spring came through there, and he built a log cabin over that spring, and then he put a trough so wide, cement trough down, and then across the end of it, and it run out then from the trough, and we'd milk the cows and drain the milk in big tall cans, and then we set it in that, and we could make jello and put it up there, and it would harden and get, you know, like putting it in the refrigerator. And we had jello and kept our milk ice cold, and our butter and stuff like that, our cream. And we'd put butter in, pack it in, make it in pound. We had the butter molds, you know, and we'd make it in pound molds, and then pack it in those tin cans and put down in the spring, and it just kept just hard as a rock. That spring was a wonderful spring. We made our own ice cream up next to the hill. We had a place, and it was just slate rock in there, and it would come these big snowstorms, and the 4th of July we went up there and got sacks of ice and made our ice cream with. So we had it pretty nice in lots of ways, you know, to what. And we had ice cream anytime we wanted it, because we had all the other. We had chickens and eggs. So it wasn't, when you stop and think about it, it wasn't too bad.
We used to smoke a lot of fish, and we'd catch a lot of fish and smoke them, and sometimes my mother would can fish. There was lots of fish in the river. Gee, we used to go down and with my dad and uncle, and caught 100 pounds of fish every time they get out. They used to have nets, and they'd net those fish.
It was just a regular school. They had the teacher there, and the teacher boarded at the ranch. She stayed there at the ranch. And the boys, some of the men would go over and build the fire in the school in the morning, you know, and have it nice and warm when the teacher went over and the kids.
They would have quite a lot of activity at the schoolhouses. They would have, I remember they'd have spelling bees and arithmetic bees, and a lot of the people would participate in that. They'd have adding. They'd put down a whole bunch of numbers, and whoever could add the fastest won the prize. Some of them old farmers could sure add quick. There's an old Russian nobleman that's left. He fought a duel in Russia, and he won the duel, but he had to leave because I guess he hurt the guy with his saber duel that he had. So he went to South America, and his name was Herr Dick von Tronet. He was a Russian nobleman, and then he rode a horse from South America clear to Glendive, and then he homesteaded this side of Glendive. Well, he wasn't getting along very good with the locals, ranchers around there, and he wanted some of his own friends, so he came down to the ditch where all those Germans were working, and he told them about the homestead they could get at Stippick, and he was quite smart. So he got him to go to Glendive, and how he worked it, but anyway, he got the clerk and recorder to open the office at 1:30 at night, and they all recorded their homesteads, and the next morning when the local people wanted their homesteads, they were already taken up, and they never could figure out how that happened. Up and down the river, it seemed to me like it was mostly German people, but got it further away from the river, it's mostly Norwegians, it seemed like, Scandinavians. Awful lot of Scandinavians further away from the river, but the Germans liked to be near the river where they could fish and hunt. There were all kinds of English and Irish and Scotch, and for some reason or other, a lot of those Germans weren't accepted amongst those people, but my dad was one of the few that they accepted. I remember my folks talked German when we were kids, little kids, and then they wouldn't talk German anymore because, well, Ma said we was going to have to learn to talk English, and so we talked English all the time.
They wanted to become part of the United States, that's right, not that. But they had to leave where they were learned that. They did. Americanized. They didn't do that. A little bit. Some of them would talk Gaelic. But very little, very little. If some of them would do that, they weren't liked. Because you didn't know why they were talking about you or me, you know. And that was hushed up pretty damn quick. The Scots wasn't much on homesteading, nor the Irish either. They didn't want land, because they were running this livestock on the land and not paying nothing for it. There was no fences, it was all open. Then the government helped them to put in dams here and there back in the hills. And then they started leasing and buying. The Norwegians was good sheepmen, the best. They went in for a coarser and a bigger sheep than the others. Ingomar and Big Timber and these places. Big Timber and Ingomar. Ingomar was the biggest sheep shearing shed in the world. There was 36 men, 18 men back to back shearing at Ingomar. Not too many Italians out here. There was some. See, my wife's straight Italian. But they worked in the coal mines and stuff like that. They weren't much on the livestock.
Some of the farmers, a lot of them were Danes. They brought some of the Dane farmers come in here. Of course, brought in one Dane, and then he'd get his friends up here. But there were a lot of German Russians in here too.
There was quite a few Russians and Germans. Yes, there was. But they mostly tried to farm. They did. And they left because they couldn't make it. Yes, there were several of them east of here. Yeah, and down the Porcupine. Yes, that's right, there was. But they couldn't make it. But the crop would grow good and then get a few hot days and it dried up. What the hell good was it? It would blow away. Eh? So they had to get the hell out of there while they had a few dollars to go.
This country wasn't plowed up and put into farming. It was the range, and they had cattle and sheep. That was the main. There was no, and the haying. They had lots of hay, and sometimes they sold hay, and sometimes they didn't. But I never seen the crops put out. Or maybe they'd raise a patch of oats or something like that for their sheep, for the buck sheep, but they didn't. They didn't go to extremes of putting in crops.
The lower Yellowstone Valley would have never got developed if it had been for the big irrigating ditches and the water. It was important. But of course, when they first settled it, the ranchers didn't know much about irrigating and cared less. And about 1928, I think, the bankers owned a lot of the land up and down the Yellowstone, and they didn't know what the world to do with it. And they were talking about completely abandoning the Lower Yellowstone project. The whole thing was going to be abandoned. And then this banker got the idea if he went down to Colorado and places like that, maybe he could recruit some real good irrigated farmers. So he did, and he went down to, I think, Colorado mostly, and Oklahoma, and he brought up, I suppose 20, 30 families. And he come up in the Lower Yellowstone Valley, and they knew how to irrigate and feed sheep and lambs, and that turned the thing around. So then it was all right after that. But they didn't know how to irrigate, and they didn't care about it, and didn't want to. They didn't want to run over that land with rubber boots. So that's what they had to do. Irrigation, very important. The Lower Yellowstone Project and the Buffalo Rapids Project and the Kinsey Project, the Huntley Project, that's all. You see, when they get a real darn dry year, 2 or 3, the only place you can raise any hay is on the irrigation. They weren't as good a conservationists as they are now because they just didn't know any better, I guess. They'd plow up a whole quarter section and the wind would blow it away. They didn't strip crop it, and they didn't stubble mulch much, and I know times if they had a good stubble, they would, like the right kind of wind, they'd burn the whole thing off. Burn the whole 160 acres off, plumb slick. And then of course they thought that was good because it burned up a lot of weeds and everything, but it wasn't good in the long run because no mulch left on the land. It was tough for all of them. It was hard work. Wash clothes by hand, and they'd can vegetables, and it was darn sight harder on the women, I thought, than it was on the men. All that clothes washing by hand, and carry water from the pump with a couple of buckets. Sure was tough for the women.
We lived on the ranch there. We stayed at the ranch, and I didn't know nothing about horses or anything. I'd never been on a ranch. And after I was there for a little while, my father-in-law said to me he always called me Dilly. He said, "Get your overalls on." He said, "You got to go to the field." And I turned around and looked at him. I said, "What am I going to do out there?" He said, "You're going to rake hay." So I got ready and I went to the hayfield. I learned to rake hay after the team ran away with me and dragged me in the hay rake for a little ways and dumped me in the ditch. And I got up and caught my team and went back to raking hay. So I guess I made it all right. From then on, I worked in the hay fields every summer. So you all worked. You didn't sit around. They worked right out in the fields. Worked putting up the hay in. And then when my children were little, we lived on the lower place, and I'd get up early every morning and take those little kids, and we'd walk a mile up to the ranch, and I helped. And my sister-in-law was on the main ranch then, and they was running it at that time, and we'd go up there, and I helped in the hay fields. The kids would play around till time to have lunch, and then we'd go eat our lunch and back to the fields.
They'd help in the fields. They'd help shock the wheat, and poor women. It's a wonder that they would even go out there in the country. Of course, if they could get away, they skedaddled and left too if they could.
I got married and went on to the ranch, and we lived in my grandma's, that picture I got of the grandma's homestead. We lived there. And that was then the winter of the terrible snows. We had a bunch of sheep, and the boys had to haul hay at night, and the hay was shipped in from Washington, and they'd sprayed the orchards, and the hay was poisoned from that sprays. And we had 1,500 head of sheep, and we'd build a big sheep shed up there on the place. And that winter, the terrible snows, when spring came, after I'm hauling all that hay and working nights, and it got 60 below, and our sheep froze standing right on the bed grounds. Now that sounds weird, but it was the truth. And the men would work till 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning hauling that hay in, to try and save them. And when spring came, we had 45 lambs and about 200 or 300 head of sheep left. $9,000 in the hole buying that poisoned hay. And everybody went bankrupt. There was no way of getting out of it. You just couldn't. You couldn't make it. It was pretty bad. There was no crops, not for the dry land farmers, and they tried to put in crops. And I know at the ranch, we was so short of water, and we used to haul water from the spring to and water our garden, what garden we raised, but it was just so hot you couldn't raise nothing. It was terrible. And it was pretty poor pickings. I know sometimes it was awful hard to even find a postage stamp to mail a letter. If we hadn't had our cows and, milk cows, stuff like that, I don't know what it would have done.
Well, I can remember the skinny cattle. Cattle were thin, didn't have enough to eat. And of course, the people them days didn't put up as much hay as they do now. For one thing, they didn't have good hay machinery, and everything put up with a pitchfork. And it was just poor cattle. They just kind of struggled through the winter. That was a tough one, tough years. Short but very severe depression, very severe. Couldn't get enough out of your cattle to pay the freight to Chicago.
They were leaving. They were leaving their homesteads. They couldn't make it on 320. It was all horses too. And they were leaving, right and left. And down on the Porcupine, it was flat. It looked great. Good fences on it. But it was no good, that gumbo, when you plowed it. And the crop would come up nice, but you got a few hot days and it just burned up with nothing. So it was the worst down on the little porcupine and the big porcupine. It was no good to farm, not that gumbo. But the people didn't know it, for it was flat, it looked great. I went into shacks down here on the porcupine, and I went in there, and the table was set where they eat, and they never picked up a thing, they just left. That's the God's truth. I couldn't believe it. I went into this little, I could show you the shack's not there now, not at all. It would be about 10 or 12 miles from here. And I went into this shack, it was on section 2. I think it'd be 1140. I think it would be, and by God, it's there where they eat. They never picked up a damn thing. They just left. There was a guy had a big steamer, and he went into Wildcat. That was a deep creek, a big cut bank. Wildcat they called it, run into the east fork of the Porcupine. And he had a big steamer, and it was either 10 or 12 plows behind it. And he must have started her up and got off her and headed her for the cut bank. And the tractor went over. I couldn't believe what the hell it was till I got down there, looked, and them plows were sticking up in the air. The first plows were stuck in the bank, but the tractor was down in the bottom, and these other plows were standing up there. And it sat there for years. They cut it up in World War II for scrap iron. That's a fact. I could show you the cut bank where it was. And he just got disgusted, and he had to start her up and get off her.
A lot of them left, yeah. A lot of people left. Well, they didn't have enough land to warrant staying, because in this country it takes quite a lot of land to survive. In those days, they just had 160 acres, 320 acres. Wasn't enough. They just couldn't make it go. They just didn't have enough land. So, just a lot of them left. Gosh, I think this place that I've got, I think at one time I was figured up there was about 9 homesteaders on what land I've got, different landowners. I think it's about 9 of them. 160 acres and 80 acres, 320.